Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, so this is our second video, still looking to outline Meillassoux' position as he puts it forward in After Finitude. And so the follow on from the first video we looked at correlationism, the idea that in order for for us to talk about any kind of being, we can't get outside this correlation that exists with ourselves as thinking beings. So being to the extent that we can talk about being itself, we can only talk about it as being itself for us, for me, for a thinking being from this perspective. So being is always correlated with a thinking being. And Meillassoux doesn't like that because, well, I guess it puts human beings in this it gives them a kind of privileged position, because being itself doesn't have any meaning outside that subjective correlation with us. And it also means that there is no sense in which we can talk about being itself. There is no absolute that we can grasp in any sense. And Meillassoux, he wants to find a way to access an absolute of some sort. And so that's what we're going to be looking at in this video, how Meillassoux is going to get to that point. So I've broken it up into three parts. We'll look at factiality first, then limiting this situation which we'll come across called hyperchaos, and then from there's a short section in which we'll deal with the Necessitarian Inference. So the first section, factiality. So the basic goal, like I said in the intro for Meillassoux here, is to find a way to access a non-metaphysical absolute which is capable of founding science's discourse. So let me break it down. There are two parts to that idea. The first is we're looking for something non-metaphysical. So remembering the definition from the last video, that means that the absolute Meillassoux is looking for will not be an entity. It won't be a particular being, a specific kind of being. So he wants something that's not going to cash out in a single kind of being, like for example the main thing that Meillassoux is working against here, I think, is a being like God. So it's not going to be a specific being, and it also has to be an absolute capable of founding science's discourse. So that means it's going to have to be non-correlational. It's going to have independence from any kind of thinking being. It has to stand on its own. And this is all because he wants to find a solid ground for science. So he says, or I've said there, capable of founding science's discourse. So we want something, or Meillassoux wants something that can give us true objectivity. Because at the moment, according to Meillassoux, we've got this problem where we want to talk about, or science in particular wants to talk about, the world as it is. But philosophy with correlationism is telling us, well, we can't talk about that. There is no sense in which that means anything, because the world as it is only ever for us. It's correlated with us, with our thinking. So he sees this as a the importance of it is that he's attempting to ground scientific thought. And how he does this, he comes up with this interesting solution, and it kind of, I'll run through the first one, but there are basically three different ways of formulating his answer here, and we'll look at each one of them. So the first one, and this is how he starts, he offers an argument which effectively says if you can think the possibility of your own non-being, then while this shows that your being might be contingent, at the same time, to have that thought, you must be thinking possibility itself as existing independently of your thought. So in order to think that your own non-being is possible, is merely possible, i.e. is contingent, then it's necessary that you are thinking possibility itself as having independent existence, i.e. as being non-correlational, i.e. as being an absolute. So it's like the idea is that in order to think that anything is contingent, for example, your own non-being, in order to think that possibility, to render that thing contingent, you're necessarily implying something that is absolute in the background, and that absolute is possibility itself. So what's being absolutized here is, as I say, possibility. In other words, the possible is the only thing that is necessary, that cannot be. Possibility itself is what is necessary for Meillassoux. And I've skipped over so much of that argument. I've just given you the punchline, as it were. But we'll go through it in much more detail when we get to the critical part of the series. At the moment, I just want to go through this and give you the summary. But yeah, like I say, we'll break that down in much more detail later, because that's this kind of this kind of argumentation is one of the reasons I don't like after finitude. But we won't go into that just now. So the formulation of this, the way that Meillassoux formulates this in relation to the necessary, is he says the absolute is the absolute impossibility of a necessary being. So in other words, if possibility is absolutized, a necessary being is impossible. It's impossible for there to be a being that is necessary, because what's absolute, the only thing that's necessary for Meillassoux, what Meillassoux is claiming, is possibility. Another way that he says this, that he frames this, that he puts it, is he says it is absolutely necessary that every entity might not exist. And again, just because what is necessary, what is absolute, is the possible. So it's elevating possibility or contingency to this level of the absolute, to what must be the case. And that's his non-correlational absolute. That's how he defines being itself. So that's what this looks like in relation to the possible and the necessary. But we can look at this through another lens as well. So he says, since the possible is absolutized like this means that anything can happen, i.e. anything is possible at any time, i.e. without a reason. And this is the same as saying that the absolute is actually unreason. And the way Meillassoux formulates this is with what he calls the principle of unreason. There is no reason for anything to be or to remain the way it is. Everything must, without reason, be able not to be, and or be able to be other than it is. So, yeah, it's kind of straightforward there, right? Anything is possible. There's no reason for anything to be the way it is. There are no governing reasons for anything, because because being itself is possibility, pure possibility. So we have this idea, the absolute as possible, the possible itself, and also the absolute as unreason. And he also talks about this from the perspective of facticity. And this is the third way of understanding Meillassoux' argument here. So since facticity is that fact, remember from the first video, that the structural invariants which determine our reality are neither necessary nor contingent, they're just brute facts, in other words, they're lacking any reason for being, then facticity itself is also absolutized. And he codifies this with the principle of factiality, that the facticity of everything cannot be thought as a fact. Factiality must be understood as the non-facticity of facticity. So facticity itself cannot be held to be a mere fact. That brute fact that the invariants that determine our reality are neither necessary nor contingent, that itself is not a contingent fact. It itself is necessary. So while facticity tells us that those structural invariants are neither necessary nor contingent, facticity itself is necessary, is absolute. That facticity itself can't be held to be a mere fact. It is what is absolute. So he's the non-facticity of facticity. Facticity itself is necessary. Another way he puts this is to say the non-iterability of facticity. In other words, same thing, the impossibility of applying facticity to itself. Now that probably sounds very wordy, right? Like there's a lot of concepts, and we're throwing some. It might seem like a lot has gone kind of under the radar with that, and I've glossed over a lot, and I have, but that's why I don't like this. It is very conceptual. It's very semantic. It sounds like we are kind of playing with words a little bit, and I think that's what Meillassoux doing. With the kind of brief overview that I've given you here, we haven't been able to flesh out any of the details. But like I say, we'll come to that later. I just want to give you the conclusions to Meillassoux' thought in these opening couple of videos. So anyway, that's his idea of factiality, that what this non-correlational absolute that is capable of founding science's discourse is possibility itself, or unreason, or factiality, and all of those words indicate the same thing. They indicate being itself, the absolute. And so what we have here with this position is actually, if you think about it, if the possible is absolutized like this, anything can happen at any time for no reason, we have a really chaotic, we're describing a universe of chaos, right? Anything can happen for any reason at any time. And Meillassoux calls that hyperchaos. And that's going to be the subject of the next section, where we're going to look at how we can limit that hyperchaos. Okay, so hyperchaos, that's where we're at now. That's where Meillassoux left us. We've got this completely random, chaotic universe. And the problem for him then is that the goal was to ground scientific discourse. How can a situation of hyperchaos give us any capacity to talk about anything in a scientific sense, which is founded on laws and order and regularities? How does this chaotic picture give us that? Well, Meillassoux asserts that this principle of unreason actually entails that there are certain determinate conditions that every entity must conform to. In other words, he says that if we think this through, we find that there are restrictions on entities. And he calls this the principle of auto-limitation. In effect, what he's saying is there is actually a limit on hyperchaos. So the first limit concerns a contradictory entity. And he says a contradictory entity is absolutely impossible. And the reasoning behind this is that if an entity were contradictory, it would be necessary, because there would be no alterity for it which it could become. And as he goes on to explain, if a contradictory entity exists, it couldn't lapse into non-being, because even if it happened not to be, it would still be in accordance with its paradoxical essence. So the very idea, so a contradictory entity by its nature is contradictory. So even if it didn't exist, because it's got a contradictory entity, it would still exist. So no matter how you look at it, there's no other for it to become. In other words, it must exist. It's necessary to exist. It's necessary that it exists. But we've already seen that the only thing that's necessary is possibility itself, unreason, factiality. So that means that a contradictory entity is impossible. And what Meillassoux is getting at with this, and that sounds like kind of coming out of left field. Okay, so a contradictory entity is impossible, so what? The idea behind this is that this lets him validate the principle of non-contradiction. So if a contradictory entity is impossible, then non-contradiction is a limiting factor. Whatever exists must be non-contradictory. That grants him, that gives him this limitation. So even though there is hyperchaos, anything can be anything at any time, nothing can be contradictory. An entity cannot be contradictory. So that's the first limitation. The second limitation he calls the thesis of the there is. And this basically just says that the thing in itself, being itself, the absolute, actually exists. And the argument that he gives for this is essentially this has the same form as the one that I briefly talked about earlier regarding possibility. And the idea is basically, if you can think that it is a fact, not a necessity, that factual things exist, then you are necessarily thinking fact itself as necessary. Maybe you can see the parallels with that. in order to argue that it's a mere fact, in order to put the objection forward, it's a mere fact that factual things exist, then Meillassoux saying, actually what you're doing is thinking factiality as necessary. In other words, there is something, i.e. factiality, which is absolute, which is the thing in itself. So even to formulate an objection against Meillassoux is to inadvertently support his claim that the thing in itself exists. It supports his thesis of the there is. And again, it's difficult to fully appreciate that without going into it in detail, because it is it's very wordy, right? It's very semantic. And but I mean, I'm not going to go into the details just yet. It's another argument that we'll pick up later on in the series. So what we have then with these two limiting conditions is that we've actually come full circle back to Kant's version of weak correlationism, which, if you remember from the first video, said that we have access to a non-metaphysical absolute which is unknowable but thinkable, and this absolute is non-contradictory and it actually exists. And those were the two conclusions that Kant, with his weak correlationism, was still able to affirm. That being in itself is non-contradictory and it actually exists. And this is what Meillassoux has claimed to have reasoned his way into, such that, or by giving us an absolute that is facticity, unreason, possibility. So, yeah. Again, it is, I feel like I've rushed over that a lot, and I have, but that's the essential outline. So with that, Meillassoux has now given us this access to an absolute that's non-metaphysical, but that's also non-correlational, and an absolute that actually exists, we can affirm actually exists, and we can affirm is non-contradictory. So the principle of non-contradiction holds with regards to being, with regards to reality. And that just leaves us with the final section for today, which is the last kind of, it's an objection that Meillassoux raises and to his own position and provides a solution for, and that is the Necessitarian Inference. So here, the idea is that Meillassoux says, okay, there's an objection to everything I've said, and it is kind of an obvious one. If everything were contingent, if everything were pure, if being itself was pure possibility, anything could be anything at any time for no reason, then this would mean that the physical laws would also be contingent. In other words, they'd be changing all the time, and they'd be changing for no reason. And this Meillassoux says is the frequentialist implication, the idea that if chaos rules like this, the physical laws that we observe would be constantly changing. However, since this isn't what we observe regularities, we observe laws of nature that seem consistent and that hold over long periods of time, then these laws must be underwritten by a necessity that rules out disorder. And this is precisely the Necessitarian Inference. And Meillassoux' answer to this involves another one of these arguments that is very conceptual based and very wordy, but I'm just going to give you the overview here. Essentially, he claims that the Necessitarian Inference is a piece of probabilistic reasoning which applies to objects within the universe. So to think in terms of, since hyperchaos rules the day, we ought to see everything changing all the time for no reason. That attitude, that intuition, applies only to objects within the universe. And then he invokes something called the transfinite to argue that we can't apply the same reasoning to the universe itself. So our intuition here concerning objects within the universe, when we step back and try and apply that same intuition to the universe itself, becomes unreliable. And again, there's a lot more to be said about this, but we'll investigate that in more detail later. I actually do have some sympathy with this way of thinking, however, which is my there's good and bad with Meillassoux for me. There's a lot that I do agree with, that I sympathize with, and that is a part of my own metaphysics, but a lot of where Meillassoux takes it, and in particular how he gets there, I have some problems with. But we'll look at that more later. So that's where I'm going to stop here, because this is kind of a natural break point at this point. So let me have a look at a summary. First up, factiality. And the goal here is to find a non-metaphysical absolute capable of founding science's discourse. We want something, or Meillassoux wants something, that gives us that objectivity that science depends on. Something that gives us something independent, an absolute, a being independent of us. And he finds this in possibility first. So possibility is absolutized, and this cashes out essentially as the absolute impossibility of a necessary being. If possibility rules the day, if possibility is absolute, there cannot be anything necessary, because the only thing necessary is possibility itself. Another way he frames this is with the principle of unreason. So there is no reason for anything to be or to remain the way it is. Everything must, without reason, be able not to be, and or be able to be other than it is. And this is just that same idea cast in the terms of reason. And the same thing expressed in the terms of factiality gives us the principle of factiality, which is that the facticity of everything cannot be thought of itself as a fact. Factiality must be understood as the non-facticity of facticity. So facticity itself cannot be just a mere fact, a contingent fact. Facticity itself is the absolute. It's possibility itself. It's unreason. And then we moved into the second part, which was limiting hyperchaos. So with the principle of factiality, we have a state of hyperchaos, but Meillassoux claims that there are actually two limitations to this state. The first was that a contradictory entity is absolutely impossible. And the argument briefly was, if a contradictory entity was, then it couldn't not be, because being paradoxical, even if it wasn't, it would still be. So a contradictory entity has no other in which it can become. And that violates, as we saw, the principle of unreason, or possibility, or factiality, however you want to address it. And the second limitation was the thesis of the there is, and this just says that the thing in itself actually exists. There is a non-correlational absolute. And with both of those limitations on hyperchaos, we find that we are returning to Kant's weak correlationism. So in other words, Meillassoux successfully found a non-metaphysical absolute, which is unknowable, but still thinkable as facticity, unreason, which is still thinkable as non-contradictory and absolutely and actually existing. And this absolute is facticity, unreason, possibility. Then finally, we talked about the Necessitarian Inference, which is Meillassoux' response to the objection that since we see the laws of physics as stable, they then must be underwritten by a necessity. And Meillassoux' postulate here of hyperchaos doesn't seem to align with this. And Meillassoux rejects this through the transfinite, which again I haven't said much about yet, but we'll talk more about later. The bottom line is that the probabilistic reasoning the Necessitarian Inference relies on can't be applied to the universe itself. It only applies to objects within the universe. And that brings us to the end of this video. So a slightly shorter video. The video next week is also going to be a little bit shorter, but it's going to wrap up this summary, this outline of Meillassoux' position, and then we can get into the meat of it and start dissecting it and pulling it apart a little bit, I guess. Anyway, that's where I'm going to stop here. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.